So there's been a flood of federal dollars that have come into states, localities, and school districts. And certainly from my vantage point, anecdotally here in Massachusetts, some of those dollars have sort of been kept on the sidelines out of uncertainty for what's going to happen with state and local revenues. In some cases, those dollars have been committed but haven't been spent in large part or significantly because of workforce shortages. In some cases, there have been dollars that have been spent on sort of one-time COVID-related expenses or capital projects, but there's a significant amount of money that is being committed or is planned for new initiatives or adding to general revenues. And that is setting up a potential problem because the rub, of course, is that these federal funds run out in about 18 months or so. And so there are a lot of school districts who may be approaching or falling off that cliff, who are either going to need to develop those wings or prepare for a pretty significant fiscal crash. And that's the topic that we're going to be talking about today. And in particular, featuring Dr. Marguerite Roza, who will be giving us an update on her ongoing work, looking at the data about how these ESSER dollars are being spent. And I need to say that after her presentation, hopefully there'll be ample time for us to have questions and answers and discussions. So be thinking about questions as she speaks. And also for those folks who are online, we're going to be monitoring the Zoom chat, and hopefully we'll be able to engage some of your questions in the dialogue during the course of time as well. I also need to mention that in addition to obviously being broadcast online, this session is being recorded. So keep that in mind. If you open your mouth, it'll be out there forever. And will ultimately hopefully be posted on our website as well. Without further ado, Dr. Marguerite Roza is research professor at Georgetown University, director of the Edunomics Lab, a research center focused on exploring and modeling education, finance, policy, and practice. I invite you to review her CV in greater detail, but suffice it to say that she's one of the country's leading experts in public education finance, and I'm honored and privileged to have her here today to share with all of you. So, Dr. Roza.
Well, thank you. So should I be speaking?
We can't hear.
Try that.
Okay, so we'll do both, whatever this is. Okay, so I'm here for a super cheery topic today to talk about the cliff, the perfect storm ahead, all the dreary financial stuff, but there's also a lot of opportunity and a lot of decisions that will matter a lot for kids coming up. So I'm going to start with a question for you all. ESSER, as you know, federal relief funds, biggest federal chunk of money ever that went into public education. On average, about $3,500 a child. I just want to see a show of thumbs here. How would you rate these investments so far? Solid, thumbs up. I mean, there's a little room for improvement, but things are going well. Mixed, you can do your thumb this way. It'd be good if we had some pivoting, or it's a disaster. Much of the spending is having no effect. And for those online who want to show your cameras on and show your thumbs, we can weigh you in as well. So we've got some mixed and some disasters and a whole lot of people who do not want to be on the record on this question. Okay, so the thing is, we're really not measuring it, right? But this is an open question right now. We're not measuring it. It's not going to ever be some big federal answer of what happened to kids as a result of these monies. But I do want to put that into context because there are a lot. It should weigh heavily on districts in the next couple of months. 3 waves of ESSER that came about. The deadline is September 2024. About 19 months from now. So we've already spent about $62 billion, and then these last 2 school years, $128 billion left. So really, right now is showtime. The money is flowing. It's going in school districts. It's being spent on salaries and materials and supplies and all that kind of stuff. I would say we got a slow start, but right now the gusher is happening. This is what it looks like when there's a lot of money in public education. We're spending it right now. So it's right now that we should be making sure that it's having an effect. So I'll put another question here. We started looking around. all this information came out that math especially turned out to be really a gap for kids, especially middle and high school math. So we went and looked up a bunch of districts to find out if they were doing anything about it, if there's anything in their ESSER funds that's doing anything about math. And we picked a sample of 20 districts that we don't normally engage with. And we found a few yeses. We found a few no's. And then we found a larger group of, there's really no way to tell publicly. No way in, oh, we know where to look, right? We looked in their budgets, we looked in their strategic plans, we looked in the meeting minutes, we looked in what they submitted to their states. So a bunch of no's and a whole lot of I don't knows. So if we want the ESSER money to deliver for kids on math, a lot of districts where, I don't know, maybe they're doing something about it, maybe they're not. Or in these ones, they're not. We know they're not. We could tell because they were very clear about what they're spending their money on, and it was not on anything on math. So, you know, can they pivot? Yeah, they can pivot. But like I said, it's showtime. It's now or never. There's not really, we can't decide this in a year from now. It'll be too late. So we'll do another poll for you all. So here's a district who hired dozens of counselors, not unusual. They did that with their ESSER funds, but attendance isn't improving. I could tell it's been steady and low, and a lot of kids are chronically absent. A board member suggests redirecting the funds at the end of this year, before the last year, to spend them on something else. What do you think? Thumb up, thumb down. There's not a middle thumb. That's not an option. You kind of got to lean one way or the other. Okay, so anybody, was there thumbs up in the room? Was there some thumbs up? There's a thumb up and there a couple of thumbs down. I saw less comfortable with this. I'm not saying you have to commit completely because we didn't give any other data or any context or anything else. I will say this is a common issue. Districts made an investment, they have nothing to show for it, and they're staying the course. Right? That's not unusual. Is there an opportunity to change the plan? Absolutely. It's budget season right now. Do we see this coming up in budget workshops? Mostly not. I've watched a lot of them. A lot of times, if it does get brought up, somebody will say, well, you know, these things take time. Or we never really asked our counselors to work on attendance. Or, well, they're brand new hires. Or, yeah, I'm concerned too, but what do you expect us to do? Lay them off at the end of the school year? Right? So all of those decisions right now are things that districts can and should be wrestling with. And it's just a reminder here that, you know, who decided how to spend the federal relief funds? 14,000 districts across the country made all their own separate decisions on that. Another one, Minneapolis used half its ESSER funds to make up for budget gaps after years of enrollment declines. So these started before the pandemic. So they know what they said. We don't want to lay anyone off right now. So we're going to use our money to backfill the budget. One thumb down, one courageous thumb down. Let's more thumb down. Somebody said thumbs up. And there is a concern, right? The layoffs in the middle of the pandemic might have felt quite disruptive. You can imagine them saying, why would we do that right now? Our schools are in so much tumult as it is. And so this is not unusual. There are a lot of districts right now that are propping up their budgets that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do with their ESSER funds. When the ESSER funds run out, that's the cliff we're talking about. Okay, how about this one? The Virginia district is funding 10 professional development days per year. That is their investment in learning loss. So that you had to set aside 20% of your money for learning loss. And they went with the 10 professional development days. So I got a couple of thumbs down, a thumbs up. When I do this one in a room full of, I did this with a room full of about 500 board members, school committee, school board members, got a lot of thumbs up. A lot of districts would be thumbs up and saying, yeah, we did that too. And I usually come on pretty harsh on this one. Like, do we think this is going to work? Like, do you think for the investment, the kids weren't even there, right? They weren't even there during the investment. I'm not saying that professional development is a bad idea all the time, but do we think this is the magnitude of an investment that's going to get a kid who's sitting in a ninth grade math class who didn't quite master division back on track? Do we think this will solve the problem for a lot of our third graders who aren't reading? And we should all have some some healthy skepticism on these, and maybe, but then we've got to really check and make sure. But what we're seeing is a lot of districts kind of shrugging and saying, well, that's what our teachers wanted. That's what they asked for. So that's what we spent the money on. And I guess I think, actually, I did this to a district in Virginia. I really kind of rode the guy pretty hard on this one, I have to say. And he came at this event and sat next to me at lunch, which was generous of him, and said, that thing you're doing where you're talking about investment and then you're expecting a return from it, that economist thing you're doing, we don't do that. And I think he was being really honest. He said, we generally don't. We don't think about our money and our decisions like that. We don't check if they're getting a return. And I said, well, I think you should. And he said, no, I agree. This is the first time I've been thinking about it. But this is what we need to happen in these budget meetings coming up. And there are a lot of pressures on school districts because ESSER is not the only pressure. So yes, there's all this pressure for leveraging our ESSER to do the most for students, but there's also this very significant looming cliff related to enrollments, inflation, the end of ESSER, and so on. So I want to pivot and talk about that for a minute. So here we are, later in 22, 23, got another school year, 24, 25. So we're going to look at some forecasts here. So we at Edunomics Lab went through all the numbers and came up with our predictions. So I'm going to show you the net prediction, and I'm going to show you why we're predicting it. So obviously it'll vary by state and district, but right now we're in a positive shock situation, financial shock. So the positive and the negative financial shocks are above and beyond or below what we would normally expect. So normally we expect revenues and expenditures to kind of grow in a maybe 4%, 5% a year kind of scenario. So above or below that, we're in a positive shock right now. Next year is also a positive shock, not as strong. 24, 25 goes far in the negative shock direction. 25, 26 still negative, but not as deep. So if you haven't addressed this, it's gonna carry over. So we've actually named 24, 25 the bloodletting, just to be gory, right? Like think of vampires and stuff. So how did I get there? So what we're talking about are shocks to school districts' budgets. So, and I'll tell you the per pupil in a minute. Okay, so ESSER, obviously it's a positive shock right now. It's just got extra money. And then it ends abruptly. And most at risk are districts that are using ESSER for recurring financial commitments, backfilling, new hires, permanent raises. We have our database up there if you want to look up your district or any other district and see what they're spending their money on. That's available. And then districts, another shock is enrollment declines. This is mostly a negative shock. Most districts are seeing on average enrollment declines from the pandemic, but steady enrollment declines going forward of about 0.5% per year. And that's because young people are not having kids at the same rate my generation did. So a little lecture about that one. A lot of it is just that we have fewer kids in the US right now. So most at risk, urban districts, we saw more movement out of those. Districts that are closed longer, some of the northern states. Part of it is demographic, but another issue is inflation and labor scarcity and new hiring. Those are driving up district recurring commitments. So here, most at risk, any district that offered a permanent raise larger than typical raise in a normal year is 1 to 2% of a COLA, because that comes on top of a 3% step and column. So when you're hearing 7% raises and things like that, those things are going to have a long hangover for school districts. An economic slowdown, if we have one, would affect growth in state revenues, probably in about 2 years from now. So most at risk are districts that are more dependent on state money or in states that are more affected by economic slowdowns. So let's put all these together. ESSER is a positive shock right now, and it ends. Enrollment declines are a steady negative shock. Inflation, we just gave out a lot of raises and made more commitments, hired more people. That's going to take a while to mitigate its effects. And right now we're in state surpluses. We're in positive situation. Those look to be going more constrained going forward. So state revenues have grown maybe 5 or 6% a year, and if they don't keep up with that, if they grow only 2 or 3%, then that's a negative shock. That's what the net impact. You can see everything goes negative in 24, 25, and that's why we've come up with that summary figure. So districts are, have not seen anything like this before, ever, even in the last recession. So it's going to get, some trade-offs are going to be really significant, and you would think we don't see it coming. So here's Seattle. Here is what's happening, percentage change to their student enrollment. Here's what's happening, percentage change to their staffing. So we're adding staff while losing kids. I live in Seattle, so you could kind of see this happening. And so you look ahead and say, can't really continue this, so we're probably going to have to do layoffs or something. This is Spokane, but we've seen hundreds of these. It's the budget they submitted last spring for this current school year, and it has the forecast for several years here. And I know you don't want me to take you through all these numbers, so I won't. But they list their revenues and they list their expenditures, and at the bottom you can say, oops, even in 23, 24, we'll be spending more than we're taking in for revenues, 12 million more a year. And then the next year, 61 million more. So we're in the red, $61 million. And the next year, oh no, we don't have a plan. Our plan is just to keep spending down, which obviously the math doesn't work, right? Something is going to have to change. 114 million, it's not even that big of a district. That would mean just balancing the budget, cutting $5,000 per kid. $5,000 per kid. I mean, it was like devastate Spokane. Like we have to kind of figure that out. So we're seeing districts sort of just lay this out like this. That's kind of the plan. I mentioned the enrollment declines. This is New York City. So I'm going to take a second on this graph to show you what's going on here. This is spending by school. Each of these is a school. This is performance. And I only pulled the higher poverty schools. They're all elementary. So it's a big district, as you know. The size, these are larger schools, these are smaller ones. This quadrant down here are expensive schools with really lousy outcomes. That's how you could read this graph, right? Notice something about them. They're really small, right? So in New York City, we've got a lot of small under-enrolled schools that we're spending more money on, and they're not delivering for kids. That's sort of a recipe for disaster, right? So they're expensive and the money isn't even getting value for our students. By the way, this data we pulled through our NERDS data. Has anyone ever heard about that? Heard of NERDS? It's a database on school by school expenditures, and it has every school in the country in it. It's the National Ed Resource database on school spending. No one here has heard of it? Marty has, John has. Okay, good. I will give you guys each a pair of nerd socks then. These are for you. I was going to say. Anyway, it's a new database. John, I think we maybe already sent you these, did we not? Because he's on our advisory board. Okay, so raise your hand. She's on my team and works on this database, and she came. So the NERDS database has a motherload of brand new data to do things like this, and you can get there just in case you're looking for financial data on schools. You can see it there at that NERDS base. We also have these scatter plots set up for any district in the country on our website at Edunomics Lab, spending versus outcomes. So you can play around for those, see if your school is in this quadrant, which I said expensive is lousy, or this quadrant might be like an ROI superstar kind of thing. And they, by the way, the patterns look different in every district. But so knowing that you all come from different places, a district in your state assumes that the legislature will increase revenues enough to address any financial gaps. So you're nervous about that. Marty, you guys are you saying, yeah, they'll probably do that here. Yeah, they have a plan. Okay, and the plan is to increase revenues by more than 16% on top of any inflationary growth. And then, so after we're done with that, what will we have? A much better education system, or will we have propped up an under-enrolled education system with a bunch of schools that look like those New York ones? Yeah, okay. All right, so it'll be more expensive and the same. Okay, all right, just want to check. For most states, this is a stretch. They're not gonna come up with all that money, especially if it doesn't look like they'll have much to show for it. Legislatures, they're worried about, 18 months from now, an economic slowdown and making trade-offs with higher ed and some other things. So most districts are going to go into budget cutting. And this is what budget cutting looks like. Budget cutting starts with a phase we call freeze. And not much happens, but we freeze travel and we freeze hiring and a few other things. We delay some payments, et cetera, but we don't really save any money, but we do burn some time. And then we enter a phrase we call trim from the top. And in trim from the top, the district says, okay, we want to try to protect the classroom and labor. So we're going to get rid of some payments to community contracts. We'll eliminate a professional development day and cut some central office and consolidate some departments. Again, maybe 1 to 2% is all you really save from that, because almost all the money in education is in labor. So if you say we don't want to touch labor, you really didn't save very much. So anytime you have a gap over 2 to 3%, what you're going to ultimately have to do is make labor cuts. So then the next phase is a phase we call negotiate. And this is like, we tried this, the budget is still not balanced. We're worried the state's going to intervene and we don't want to do that. So let's talk about changing benefits, salary adjustments, reducing days, furloughing days of school. So you pay you pay teachers less and the kids don't get any school for those days. And this also, and I mean negotiate, I don't only mean with unions, but also with unions. I mean, the board negotiates and the departments negotiate and people are talking back and forth and they're not on agreement. And then there's only one phase left when you don't have a lot of money. And this phase you can sort of do overnight. And it is called a labor reduction. And this is often what happens in the final hour of school districts that have to do really pretty deep cuts. They just start issuing pink slips. So larger staff layoffs will usually start with electives, maybe librarians, coaches, and then depending on how many, get into core teachers. Yes. I mean, if it's pressing on this, but I'll have time. So school closure is just really a way to, when you have too many schools, you don't really save much unless it means you can operate fewer schools with fewer labor. So sometimes district will say, I'm not gonna lay off any labor, but I'm gonna close the school. But what they're really saying is, I would have to hire right now to be able to continue managing all these schools. And I'm going to absorb all my attrition and take my people and have them fill the empty spots in other schools. So if you could keep the schools open, but you've got like a zombie crew of staff in every school, there's barely enough staff to offer the full complement of services. Okay. So, I said that's what it looks like, but I want to point out what we're seeing around the country right now. We are seeing a lot of districts with enrollment drops, maybe running too many schools, and a lot of them doing some things that we would say are head in the sand kind of moves. So I'll show you what they are. We can use attrition over the next few years to shrink. problem with attrition is you lose all of your math and science teachers and your special ed teachers, and you're left with not the right complement of people. Who doesn't leave? PE teachers, ceramics teachers, kindergarten teachers. So kids will go to school and they'll say, guess what, kids, your geometry teacher was your music teacher, but now their geometry teacher, they don't know geometry, but we have a hiring freeze right now. So that's what it means. So that we think is a kind of a head in the sand strategy. And I think it's well-meaning, but it doesn't work out right. Or this one, we're investing now to lure students back to the district. Hopefully they're investing in fertility, I guess. I guess that's what I think is most people don't go out there and even if they've left and they've gone to a private school or whatever, they don't make school switching decisions rapidly. They don't go, oh yeah, they said they're going to do this new thing. I'll quick and I'll switch back. They've rooted their family into another community. Oftentimes they've moved out of urban areas. Or this one, we'll take 6 months to study our finances and develop a strategy to solve the budget deficit. It sort of sends a message that there is a pain-free strategy if we just look around every single corner. Instead of saying, it looks like we're going to have to lay off X amount of staff unless we can come up with some sort of labor concessions, right? I think we burn up 6 months of spending more money than we have, and then we make things worse in the long run. Or, and this one really worries us, we've made a commitment we won't close schools. Don't make those commitments, right? This is sort of like we've taken the obvious strategy off the table. All right, well then the kids are going to go to schools. There's not going to be a librarian or music classes or reading coaches or counselors because you will have spread your staff so thin across so many buildings. So maybe I'll ask you this, we could do fingers. Which would you choose? So a district has a 4% budget gap. Would you say, I'll cancel the planned COLA, the pay raise, and freeze all the step and column raises? Teacher not gonna be happy about that, right? We've got inflation out there and stuff, but that's number one. Leave raises as planned and RIF, that's a reduction in force. Lay off 60 junior teachers. And when you lay off junior teachers, you have to lay off more than the percentage because they don't make as much money. Or end the school year 2 weeks early. Those are all about the same. So I see a one finger, a couple other ones. It's hard to do that though. You got to get people to agree. A couple other ones, a two. So mostly districts land on this one, end the school year 2 weeks early. And this one worries me, number three, because first of all, if you're a teacher, 1 and 3 are the same this year. They're the same this year. You lose money either way. But next year, your salaries stay the same if you're 3, and you've obligated that cost structure still. Here, you've kind of frozen the cost structure and you start over on a newer low cost structure. The problem with number 3, it's not the same for the kids, right? The kids have lost a lot of school lately. We are going to see a lot of school districts close school earlier, have Fridays off till the end of the year, that kind of thing, starting next year. So I think, we all want to avoid doing layoffs. And we've seen this, education really avoids doing layoffs. It's just really, as soon as we get into a budget deficit, we stop talking about the kids and we just talk about preserving jobs for adults. And it's amazing to watch the switch happen. Like what kids? We don't even care about the kids. We just cannot lay off anybody. And that's very different than the private sector. So in the private sector, every time a recession hits, one of these gray bands or any kind of, financial tightening, the private sector is like, yeah, see ya. They lay off some people right away. And then they recover pretty quickly and start adding jobs and pay raises, lay them off. And so they have this cycle. In education, what we're seeing is don't lay them off. And then what we can't do is give out much in the way of pay raises after that. So we often go a longer period of time with no pay raises because we never wanted to lay anyone off. And what happens is teachers get really mad that they're not getting raises and the private sector is. And part of it's because we didn't do that contract expand thing that the private sector did. Okay, so a question for you all, where and when are all these district decisions being made? And the answer is, in one of the most sleeper meetings ever, winter and spring budget workshops that they happen separately in 14,000 school districts across the country. They're not a main school committee meeting. They're usually a side one on the agenda. And I say they're a sleeper meeting because very few people show up. And so I put this on here. Not a lot of controversy in the meetings. We're not really debating all the stuff I put on here today. There's some people looking at a spreadsheet going, all right, we could do this. Okay, we could do this. All right, that sounds good. Okay, let's go for it. And we don't really absorb both those twin pressures of trying to make sure we've leveraged every bit of the money from our ESSER funds to deliver for kids. And we don't look ahead to see what does this mean for our district's financial sustainability and what happens, like if we're Spokane and we ignore this and then we get closer and closer and closer, what does that mean for our kids? So I thought I would go that far. I have some other things to tell you about, but you can see I came with more of our training-y stuff, and that's because we do a lot of training of school districts who mostly have not had formal training on education finance. We have one in New York City. We do our certificate. If anybody is really interested in digging in on this, it's a 2-day in-person program. And we also do school board finance workshops. We have one starting next week that's online, partly because our research center believes that if people had more understanding and interest and awareness of the school finance, they would make different and more thoughtful, maybe more nuanced, more informed financial decisions. Otherwise, it's sort of, again, like I said, up to the 14,000 districts in this country to decide how to spend our nation's public resources. So I'll stop there for some questions, and depending on what you ask, I might shove some more information down your throat. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you got one. Okay. So that was the first thing, is we got 2 mics because folks are online. They need to sort of hear through the mics. Sort of one immediate response is, gee, sounds like we're screwed. Which then leads to the next question is there discussion going on in Washington or elsewhere about moving the deadline out so that it doesn't become quite the cliff, and so that maybe districts think more about have more time to make decisions and think more strategically about how they use these resources?
There are lots of discussion around it. Turns out they can't really do it. It's in the law that this is the deadline, and it was not a bipartisan law, the last round. Bring it back to Congress, and then Congress is going to have something to say about the rest of the law. So it's not going to reopen it. So it turns out that you can't pay labor at all past September 2024. If you have a contract, let's say to re-roof the gym, and that was supposed to be done and finished and paid for by the following January 2025. And they said if there are extenuating circumstances, you can apply for an extension. Typically, those extensions are only like it snowed, and so we couldn't finish the roof kind of things. So most districts are not counting on those extensions, and they won't know ahead of time if they would get one. So generally, no, the money's going to get spent. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing districts on pace to spend it down. So, yep, right back here.
Thank you. It's very, very interesting information. But it strikes me that you're pointing out a colossal failure in the education of school leadership, school and district leadership over the decades, that they don't have the skills and the tools to do what they should be doing.
We think that is a major concern, which is why our research center does lots and lots of training. So historically, ed finance, the field of ed finance, was mostly focused on the revenues, state funding formulas, federal formulas, whether or not property taxes were involved in how we generated money. And only a tiny sliver of it was on the spending side. And so most people who've gotten training was heavily on the revenue picture and not on the spending. And I would say our center is focused much more heavily on the spending because we felt it got poor level of treatment for this. But in most districts, the budget process is designed to perpetuate last year's budget forever. And so what happens is, and you've got to go watch these budget meetings. The state requires a district to bring a set of financials to a board meeting that have object and function, and it's just like a spreadsheet, like the one I showed you of Spokane. And then sometimes they're supposed to be balanced, and sometimes it's supposed to have a forecast. So a budget development meeting has a bunch of finance people with these numbers going, shoot, looks like we're going to spend too much money. All right, should we put off doing that next year, or we can leave that position unfilled? And then it's balanced based on last year's numbers. Then they bring it to the board meeting and they say all in favor, and everybody says aye, and then it's done. So it's perpetuated. Nowhere did we talk about the fact that we have a school here where the kids can't read, or that, we've got these other challenges. Nowhere did we even necessarily look ahead for what does this mean. Occasionally, a board member in that final meeting will say, I've got a question on page 2 of the document, and they'll say, I can answer your question, but it's too late to change anything. And it will be too late. It will be June of the school year. You've got to pass the board, the meeting in that you've got to pass the budget in that meeting and send it forward. So by the way, we passed that budget in June. In the fall, the test scores come out, and we would want our system to say, oh my gosh, look at these test scores. We should do something different this year. But that would require talking about test scores in the context of our finance conversations, and never the twain shall meet. We've set it up to have a finance only conversation. In fact, most academic people never set foot in the finance budget workshop meetings. And so what we think that, the state ought to require something else for these meetings. Sure, bring the finances, but also bring the academics. Also force districts to revisit their budgets in the fall when they get their test scores and say, do we need to change anything here? So, but we don't do that kind of reflection in the middle of the year. We just wait till the next spring and we start the set of meetings to produce that budget document that looked exactly like last year's. And I think part of it is built into the process. We could train people differently, and we do, but somebody's got to disrupt that process. And in many states, that process is enshrined not only in the calendar, but kind of in the laws as well.
So Marguerite, you've talked a lot about the options that districts have and sort of the set of bad options that they have. I wonder if you could lay out the same for state policymakers, either legislators or state education agency leaders, in responding to this coming fiscal cliff. Like they could, as I think Massachusetts is projecting to do under the Student Opportunity Act, which predated this, to ramp up state investments to offset the cliff. They could do that while also using that as an opportunity to sort of force structural changes on districts. I don't know how feasible that would be. They could pass laws preventing districts from choosing some of the sort of worse options that you highlighted, like laying off new teachers. Maybe they could prohibit seniority-based layoffs. But what's sort of the menu available to state policymakers, and how would you encourage them to think about it?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So on our list of state policies that they should put in with, especially if they're giving away money, because if you're giving away money, now's your chance to ask for something in return. And I think I would prohibit seniority-based layoffs. Several states have, and some have it actually in law that you must do layoffs based on seniority, by the way. And what our concern is that if you do seniority-based layoffs, you are laying off your junior teachers, which tend to congregate in your high need schools. So those schools see more disruption. So we're really hurting our high poverty schools. We are still saddling districts with a lot of salaries on the high end, 6-figure salaries of teachers. So they don't really even get to cut much out of their cost structure. And so we, and that stands out in contrast to potentially choosing to use other means for making your decisions, like, well, we need to decide how many math teachers we need, or we have some evidence of which teachers are really good at teaching reading. Let's not lay those ones off. They're really good at it. We also find sometimes that seniority-based layoffs mean we've laid off all our teachers of color, and we just worked in the last couple of years to diversify our teaching force. So out the door they all go. So I think there's opportunity for states to use the legislature to change the way layoffs might be done. And I think states can, one of the things we're seeing is not enough states are in districts are really motivated to connect their spending to address their problems with their outcomes. So I would, require that all of my leaders who are spending the public funds have some training in finance, including school committee, school board members. I mean, they're the ones with the fiduciary responsibility. And we see them making well-intended bad decisions all the time because they don't necessarily think or know about what the long-term consequences are. We would suggest that a state have a oversight structure set up for when districts go into insolvency. So that would involve like tiers of intervention, whether it was advice and then monitoring, and then maybe you can invalidate contracts or do takeovers or things like that. A lot of districts, their cost structure is heavily dependent, especially in states with more unions, is heavily dependent on things that they've negotiated away years ago in labor contracts. And I think if a district has chronically low performance, more so than the mix of its kids would justify, then the state should come in with some sort of counter pressure potentially to those labor contracts. So like if your student performance drops to the bottom half or the bottom quartile, given what your mix of kids are, then you need to invalidate your labor contract and start over. So you can only do 1-year contracts. And so both your union and your district are motivated to get those student results up instead of saying, nope, you can't do that. Nope, you can't do that, because we signed it way in a contract 3 or 4 years ago. So I think there's quite a few opportunities there for legislatures to do something to adjust the balance. We think districts are not using enough data. I put up the spreadsheet on New York, but you can look up a scatter plot in any district in the country, and often districts have schools that are kind of these expensive, lower performing ones, even more so than their mix of kids would justify. You can do apples to apples kids on the chart and see that, wow, our school is still more expensive and lower performing. And I think states have a role to play to help districts really dig in on the data, because they're not trained on the data. They don't know how to do that. We've suggested that states require that those data come to board meetings on a regular basis and have be engaged with the public. That would sort of get more eyeballs on them. We've suggested that they be part of a principal's performance review, not that they have to affect their pay, but they get talked about once a year. A lot of principals don't even realize their school is lower performing than it is. And they think, well, it's because we don't have enough money. And then you look at the picture and you're like, your school has a lot more money than everybody else. So they don't even know that. So we also suggest that a state could require every districts to have a data day once a year, and they really dig in on their data and their spending and set up a plan for the subsequent year. But we need to do something to add a counter pressure for what otherwise might be the money goes into the system and we have nothing to show for it. So it really, and I'm not a fan of micromanaging schools on what they spend it on. We've done that as a placeholder instead of micromanaging schools on what kind of outcomes kids get. And so schools are like, oh, we're in compliance. We have our counselor, we've got our reading coach, we've got our class sizes and exactly where they are. Never mind, the kids can't read, but we are in compliance. So it kind of reinforces that compliance mindset that we have to get the inputs in the right place instead of saying, you guys take care of deciding how you want to spend the inputs, but I really want you to spend your time focused on whether or not you're getting it done for kids.
Hi. Will there be ever satisfaction? Like, is there any perfect example or the district school is doing. So what I'm trying to say is the stakeholders would never be satisfied whatever district school board or whatever the decision is made. So my question is there anybody going to be satisfied whatever is made or whatever the decision is made?
So I mean, you're bringing up a good question that there's always going to be people on opposite sides of issues, but our experience has been that if and there's some research out there, not by us, that confirms this, that when you bring trade-offs to the public and engage on them publicly and invite feedback on them and give your thoughts in response to them, decisions get made in a more nuanced way and people are happier with the outcome. It doesn't mean that they're super excited, but if we can have a back and forth on it, people understand what's at stake. Often the frustration is they think, you didn't even consider any alternatives, did you? And that may or may not be true, but if the public didn't hear about the alternatives in that they were considered, there's very little trust. But if they say, like, I put up these 3 options for how to cut these things, and I want to hear from people, and people say, well, I'm worried our kids, you were going to go with number 3, but I'm worried our kids have missed too much school. And they say, well, you know, our teachers aren't ready to take a hit to their salaries yet, and we think we're going to get all this money from the Massachusetts new billionaire tax or whatever it is. So we don't want to take a permanent hit on our salaries. And they say, all right, well, could we split the difference? We get rid of 1 week of school and you guys give a little bit in on your salaries. And you'll see that people are starting to understand that there are more choices in play. So our sense is that the back and forth does build trust. Not everybody's always happy, but better decisions get made. And we do see a lot of districts out there making really thoughtful decisions. So I'll give you just an example because it's a heavily unionized place, but Albuquerque, the state said, here's some money if you want to lengthen the school day or the school year. And the staff voted and it was 60% now. And the parents were like, yeah, we don't want to do that. And the district was sort of like, okay, great, we'll have to say no to this money. And they thought about it for a minute and then they said, you know what, why don't we offer it on a school by school basis? Individual schools could opt in to the money. And some of the schools said, oh, well, we had in our schools a majority yes, so we'll take it. And another one took it, another one took it. And pretty soon some of the ones that were no's changed their mind because they saw that it was kind of optional for the parents and staff could opt in. So they actually got, I think, to something like 60% of their schools decided to do it. So I think there's more to that back and forth. Dallas is another interesting one because they have, they set up in their investments that we don't know everything going forward. So they have these for their ESSER money. They wanted to add more time for kids. So they scheduled intersessions, which are fall break and spring break and Christmas break, whatever. They're going to have these boot camp sessions for kids who are behind. And they said, we don't know if they're going to work. We're going to try it out, but we are scheduling time now after the first one to figure out what worked, what didn't, and we're going to make changes for the next one. And they did that, and they're learning as they're going, and they're sharing with everybody what did and didn't work instead of sort of guarding that and staying the path. So I think there is much more opportunity to come up with win-win solutions that don't make everybody happy, but that at least help build trust in the system and move the needle a little bit. So.
So we have a question from the chat, which basically is asking whether either under federal law or whether under state law that there's an opportunity to either substitute state dollars for federal dollars, so you spend down state dollars and then sort of replace them later. Sorry, you spend down federal dollars first, then you replace them with state dollars later, or alternatively that you can carry forward surpluses from one year to the next, again, sort of using local resources rather than federal resources, or is the federal law pretty restrictive on that front?
That's a great question. So Maine quietly increased the amount of reserves that districts are allowed to have through 2027 or something. So clearly that's what's going on, right? Let's bank our state and local dollars. We'll spend our federal and we'll have a larger reserve pool going. Many states have a limit on how much you can have in reserves because they want you to spend today's money on today's kids. Texas didn't even do anything quietly. They just said, do what you can to build your reserves now. Spend your federal money, but it's going to get ugly, so do it. And it's sort of there are two sides to this. On the one hand, that ESSER money was for today's kids, right? They were the ones affected by the pandemic. So if you kind of stockpile it and you send some kids out the door who didn't really get very far in math and are going on through their grades without having learned reading, they're just spiraling in a negative way. So there is this imperative to get it done for kids, which I think we do have to pay attention to. But there is a lot of this kind of stockpiling. The one thing you cannot do is put your federal funds in reserves. That would be illegal. It have to be spent. Oh yeah, it's money is fungible. It's absolutely that case. Okay, you got another one? Or I didn't know if you had a, sorry.
So you've been focusing on school districts primarily. What about charter schools? So I assume they're subject to the same fiscal dynamics, the projections with respect to revenue. What options do they have in addition to those you've talked about, and what can't they do? How does it look different when you're at the individual school level?
So the charters very much mimic this whole thing. A couple of differences is charters moved more quickly to spend their federal reserves. So many of them are closer to having them spent out. And charters, a little bit more dynamic in that sense that they can move quickly. They're smaller organizations, and they can do that. So we did see more rapid movement. Charters are also pretty clear. There's sort of more eyes open about what the future looks like. So we didn't see as many permanent hires, whereas a lot of school districts, most charters aren't unionized, so they don't also subject to the union pressures on it. Right. They have that sense of they will go under. But there are so one thing we saw some charters put money into facilities. We're also seeing about maybe 30% or so of the money in the end will be in facilities. And that's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you spend the money and the project is done. There's no recurring cost. On the other hand, did it get kids back on track, right? Like, so if you redo the cafeteria, and these kids get, that project is done in 2024, the kids graduate, they don't even actually experience the new cafeteria. So they're sort of worried about that. We see about almost half of the money of ESSER spent on labor. And what you can't tell across the board is, how is it spent? Is it a permanent pay raise? We saw a lot of those. Is it a one-time bonus? We saw some of those. Is it new hiring? Those are all labor expenses. And new hiring is also concerning because people assume that once I get hired by the district, I have my job for life if I want it. So, so permanent pay raises and new hiring is the part of that ESSER spending that's probably going to create the most painful cliff.
So my question is, what role does like supplanting play in the spend down of ESSER funds?
And so by supplanting, you mean I'm going to use the ESSER funds to pay for something I would have otherwise spent my state and local dollars on.
Correct.
So, I mean, they're allowed to do that. So there's not really a federal law that says you can't. Some states turned to their districts and said, all this federal money is here. I know you lost kids. I know you were already going to head for some tight financial times. Here's the money, just backfill your budgets. But other ones have taken a whole line of employees that they used to pay on state and local dollars, and they're now paying for them on ESSER funds. I mean, we can see that in individual districts. You can't see it in the federally collected funds, but the federally collected data. So we can see that. Of course, that when that money goes away, they're going to have to put those things back on their regular budget. So we've been telling parents, if your kid is behind in school, like below grade level, you go in and ask the teacher, and if they don't have an answer, ask the principal, what services do you have right now to get my kid back on track? And that it's possible the district spend that money just giving out pay raises, right? We had inflation, a lot of them did that. but I still think the school owes it to the kids. So maybe those pay raises come with a teacher that hustles a little more to meet with a kid, or changes the curriculum, or sends home some ideas for how the parents can help out, and meets with the parents more regularly, or make sure that the kid gets into some additional services. But however that money is spent, I don't think we want to go many more months without making sure that each and every kid who's behind grade level or has attendance problems gets some sort of opportunity, treatment, program, services to get back on track, or these kids are going to be affected for life.
Two related questions. So one is, how much of the money have you seen spent on new services as opposed to just the pay raises and sort of keeping things going on? And then second, do you have any sense, or are there any districts that are thinking about, insofar as they implemented new services, or thinking about them in a non-LIFO fashion? So when the money runs out, are the districts just going to cut the new services because they're the newest? Are there any that are thinking about, well, actually, these services are more important and better than some other things that we were providing, or sort of, are there any districts on that?
I would say, so there are new services out there. So this district's doing summer programs was one of the most popular add-on ones. Atlanta added 30 minutes to the school day. I think that's an additional service. And there are districts trying to pull off tutoring, although that's been hard for them to kind of deliver. But I would say most of the money is not in new services. I mean, and when you look at the money, 20% had to be spent on learning loss. The interventions I just talked about are in the bounds of that 20%. The other 80%, not so much new services. Sometimes it's repaving the parking lot. So if you consider that something new and they wouldn't have done it otherwise, or like we've seen lots of new playground structure, by the way, very popular with parents. They like the new playground structure. So I think in that sense, still most of it, even in the learning loss category, a lot of professional development. Is that a new service? Not for the kids. It's not. If the teacher comes back and is so amazingly better now that they went to the professional development, that the kid can, springboard back up to the grade level, maybe. But even in the states that are tracking this, which is not many, you see a lot of, they always have another category that says other, and almost everything is an other. So it's just very, very hard to tell. The new services are the tiny slices. I was looking through Madison, Wisconsin, and they have a very clear list of exactly what they're spending their money on. And it's a small program for a new ambassador for the kids and community program. And there's like a social worker here. And then there was like a ton of money, huge, like part of it in HVAC, air quality kinds of stuff. And that was a very popular one of the facilities charges. And at least they had theirs itemized and you could see it. In some districts, it is literally just going into the budget. I mean, some districts just put all their central office staff onto the ESSER line. So what was the second half of yours? I thought. Yeah. So, continuing them. No, not so much on tutoring, more on the counselors. So we hired counselors, and then what a district will say is, we need to find a funding source for those counselors when ESSER runs out. And I'm like, it's not like you go on a scavenger hunt and look under the table or something. Like, what your funding sources are, but they're basically saying, I will prioritize this with new money. But it is really, historically, unless a district is in a fiscal crisis, they don't cut old programs that have been around there. They just don't. For them, it's cutting people that they're attached to. So even if the programs aren't working. So I think they're still going to be preserve what we've always done, unless some of the people have left, and then we're fine shrinking that. And then try to do what we can to add the new people to our ongoing budgets. So.
I'm assuming earlier on in ESSER that most of the investment is in technology. and how much of that is continuing on. And of course, with technology, there's depreciation. So in 2024, that iPad in 2020, I don't know how much it's going to be. And how effective is it in terms of student improvement? Are the district going to continue on investing in remote learning?
Technology and remote learning, two different things. Okay, so a lot of them did buy laptops early on. They also bought like masks and plexiglass and thermometers and other stuff early on. So, but the interestingly, that more of the technology purchases were in high poverty districts, and it might be because they weren't already one-to-one computing, or maybe normally replace 50% of the computers a year. It's like literally it is an ongoing cost for school districts. It's not, I don't think we know for sure. I mean, when they first went remote, they gave laptops to kindergartners, and I don't know that the schools are going to maintain a thing where they keep a laptop per kindergartner necessarily. That was a sort of a COVID thing. So I don't know for sure. There are some districts that we know of that are stockpiling laptops, because you could do a purchase order and they're all sitting in there in a warehouse. And it's kind of this thing, you're like, I hope they still work with like the new software, whatever. I don't know. But we are like, they've over purchased Chromebooks or whatever, and they're sitting around in piles because they know that the money runs out and they're going to still have this breakage every year. So.
Hi. I was wondering if you had any good examples of non-recurring investments that had more direct impacts on student outcomes. You talked about HVAC, repaving the parking lot, stuff like that. But do you have any examples of like one-time things that have direct effects on classroom experience?
Yeah, so I'm sure most of you are familiar that there's a lot of research now that says many school districts have been teaching kind of an antiquated reading curriculum. And so some districts and even some states have pushed hard on spending money now to convert all their schools to the new reading strategies. And that's come in the form of new curriculum and professional development. And I would say that's an example of an expenditure now that can both help students immediately and continue to have benefits for the next set of students and the next set of students. So that would be maybe an example of that. There are some programs that school districts have got up and running, things like having more of their teachers use Khan Academy, or parents use Khan Academy. And I think one is sort of interesting is that Long Beach has got something where they pay the high schoolers to tutor the elementary kids on using Khan Academy, and it's been something worth following. But there are options like that are more like convert to a new way of delivering services or onto a new system that could have some of those benefits. So we'll see. I think it's probably too early to tell on most of them.
Hi. Hi. Can you clarify the correlation between the test scores and the spending? So I thought I was hearing you say that historically the school strategic spending has not been great. And then more recently, there's more ed consulting companies or finance training. And so if this is the time that they are now having better spending, how come before the test scores were higher? Like, what is the correlation?
Oh, so I'm not sure completely what you're asking, because test scores tanked because kids were out of school for a year, right? So that is a thing. Okay. And the other thing I would say, like, if you look at the macro batch of research on the relationship between spending and outcomes, it is frustratingly weak, positive but frustratingly weak, where how much you spend or even what you spend it on accounts for very little of the differentiation, the variation in outcomes. And I would have to say that has been a career disappointment for me, because when I started my career many years ago, I assumed that we could look at the spreadsheet and figure out the best way to spend the money and the right amount to spend, and then presto, we would get these excellent outcomes on the other side. And I stared at that spreadsheet for years and tried many different projects, got lots of grants on that. And even though there is a positive correlation, that relationship explains very little of the variation. Sometimes you find a school that's not spending its money like that at all, and it's beating the odds for your kids. Or you find a school that's spending its money textbook exactly how it's supposed to, and they have like the worst outcomes ever, even after taking into account a mix of students and all these other variables. And I would have to say, if this was a room full of teachers, they would be rolling their eyes at me right now going, oh, did you think the humans didn't matter? Step away from the spreadsheet. The humans matter when it comes to education. And they would be right, right? They would be. So what we have not done is figured out how to instead of ignoring that human element in schooling, how to put it to work, how to steer it so it's working in the positive direction. We've sort of kept finance as though it's a separate thing, and that the human stuff is messy and just ignore it. And what we need to really do is figure out how the finance works to energize the humans, turn on those human factors, and steer them toward these kind of outcomes we want, instead of keeping these two things separate all the time. So that was probably a longer answer than you wanted, but you asked a question that sort of, you know, has a long career anxiety for me. So anyway, that's how we're kind of now merging these two, is thinking about finance very, very differently than we used to.
Thank you. So I just to clarify the ending of what you said, which is that your correlation is for moving forward, how to use the strategic financing for the learning loss, like recovery. It's not that historically that has been the correlation, which I understand.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe we can talk after. I'm not totally sure what you mean, but yes, I think we need to get more people involved. We need to connect the finance and the outcomes piece. We need to bring more people into that equation, looking for the solutions and rolling up their sleeves and trying to change that relationship. You know, at least that's what I'm putting my career against. Some closing remarks. Okay, well, I do see along the way I put up a lot of data sites, and I think we do need more people to dig in on data. Every other industry is like mining their data on how to improve, and our system isn't so much. So you know, I guess I would have an invite to everybody to dig into those. We put every bit of data we look at online on our, and they're all really hopefully easily accessible on that stuff. And then lastly, I would say, if the topic is really interesting to you, come join us in one of our certificate programs. We would love to have you.
Marguerite, thank you so much. And I actually am noticing up here, there are 2 extra pair of nerd socks. So maybe if someone like, can you sign up or register as a member? Is there a way to show your commitment in advance?
Right now that you'll look and use our nerds data, we'll give you the status.
All right. And I will say one takeaway I have, which may not be an aha to many other people in the room or around the country, but this idea of supplanting state funds, reserving them, and in particular, reserving them for a specific purpose related to addressing the sort of learning loss or missed learning opportunities. So for example, if you were to say, you know, we're going to pick a number, $10 million in state dollars, replace them with our remaining ESSER funds, and use those dollars for this summer and next summer's, you know, learning programs, summer school programs, that would be kind of interesting. Swap. Yeah. All right, so that's done. We're done with that. It's good. And the last thing I want to do is again, there are 5 more programs or colloquia that are scheduled. Hopefully, we'll have 1 or 2 more. But the next one is March 2nd, so it's Thursday, March 2nd at noon here. Although probably maybe here or maybe down in, yeah, stay tuned for the location. But it'll be somewhere in this complex. And it's Parag Pathak, who will be talking about the research he's been doing on school busing in Boston. And the title is Still Worth the Trip, School Busing Effects in Boston and New York. So that's going to be a really interesting topic. I got a little coverage in advance in the Boston Globe a couple of weeks ago. And I'm really looking forward to that. It's going to be fascinating. So thank you all for coming. Thanks everybody who's been online, and we'll